Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. Actually, it's evening. It's Mother's Day evening. So here we go. We've got today's lesson, and then we got one more lesson, and next week is going to be finals. So we'll have some essay assessments going on that time. So we're going to continue with politics, right? So have out your handout. On page 2, we're going to be going into interest groups and then also the section on voting and elections. And then last time, we'll do political parties and we'll get into the political parties of our country's history with a particular focus and attention on the Republican and Democratic parties and the big races that are coming up, particularly the presidential race in November. All right, so let's get right to it. Interest groups. Let's do this. Okay. All right, here we go. Interest groups. So in politics, one of the main goals, of course, is to try and get your country to make laws and policies and budgets and so forth that agree with you. And so we've got this whole political system and democracy where we're trying to influence the outcome of elections and how laws are made. And so we'll see political parties are going to be very important in getting folks elected, Republican, Democrat especially, but interest groups are going to have a big impact on how those elections turn out as well. And then what happens after the election or before the next election. So basically, when you think of it this way, most successful political parties are all about getting their candidates elected so they can get things done. Interest groups focus not so much around like a particular, like, let's get elections won, but let's get our policies in place in the process of how these elections are going on and support candidates that we like that can support our particular interests. So basically, an interest group is a group of people that come together to try and to get laws and policies and budgets and so forth in their favor, okay? Now, here's an interesting thing about an interest group. They may end up supporting both of the two major parties, okay? And in fact, quite a few of the most successful interest groups have support in both. It doesn't happen all that way. Let's go through some examples, see some of the kinds of things that they do, and then see some of the differences as we go through, okay? All right, so one thing that interest groups do, the most successful ones, is effective lobbying. All right, this is a main tactic. Let me see, did we jump ahead on that one? Yeah. They are going to try to influence the elected officials to make laws and policies their way, right? So the idea is that they're going to hang outside of the Senate and the House chambers in the lobby so that they can talk to the members of Congress when they come out, or in the state legislature, you got these lobbies. So they're called lobbyists. Basically, the interest groups that have enough money, organization, they have these regular people who work for them, who build connections and foster relationships with the lawmakers to try and get laws written in their favor. In fact, sometimes the lobbyists themselves will write the proposed laws and get their friendly legislators, members of Congress, to do those kinds of things. They'll also work within the executive branch and state and federal, right? So you get your lobbyists working with, the people in the White House and so forth, the people in the governor's office to get their ideas and so forth out there. They, like I say, they're spending money. I mean, one thing you can see, for example, is as lobbyists, interest groups identify candidates, politicians who they like, who are helping them out. They want to do everything they can to get them elected, all right? So not only are they going to be helping them with ideas and so forth in the legislature, but they're going to be sending money. Now, we saw in the last episode that there's some limitations on how much money they can actually give to the candidate or to the candidate's party. But remember, can an interest group spend as much money as it wants on its own, saying nice things about the candidate that they like? So they can have a big, big influence. Conversely, if they don't like somebody, they can say a lot of negative things. In fact, sometimes interest groups kind of take on that role so that let's say you got two candidates, right? And one doesn't really want to say that much negative about the other because he looks bad, looks like a jerk. So they get interest groups that are supporting them and they go on the attack. They do the tough ads and so forth. So then this candidate is like, oh, I don't know, that wasn't me. They can be like, oh, innocent and everything, that they weren't doing the negative types of things, okay? Notice this, as I say, if you got full-time lobbyists, the most successful interest groups are going to have the full-time lobbyists. They're also going to have lawyers. Back up to the one above that. You got legal and courtroom tactics. So sometimes you can get things done by getting laws changed. Sometimes you just bring a lawsuit. You bring it to the courts. Now, it does help if you've got judges that see things your way and that have been elected, or in the federal case, appointed by a president and approved by a friendly Senate that agrees with how you want things to go. So for example, we saw this in the Civil Rights Unit, right? Civil Rights Movement. Did they have friendly federal judges that were against segregation and in favor of some of the objectives of the Civil Rights Movement? Yes. And those federal judges ruled in their favor. They stopped some of the segregation, they helped them out, and so forth. So a tactic of interest groups sometimes can be to go to courts. So for example, an environmental interest group, right? They see that something's going to be done and they don't like it. It's going to impact the environment in a bad way, or species and so forth. They go to court, right? They go to court, they get it stopped. If there are friendly judges who agree with their point of view and so forth, that might be enough. Who knows? Use lots and lots of various different battles. And as we go through, we'll see some of the groups that kind of go, they're sometimes on opposite sides of each other in these particular battles. Okay, all right, let's go to the next one. Grassroots lobbying. This is very interesting. One of the things that interest groups try to do is create the impression, that may be true, that there are a lot of people out there. It's like the whole grassy fields are full of voters that care a great deal about these issues, and politicians, these voters want to be heard. So one of the things that interest groups do sometimes, particularly if they're big interest groups, like we'll see that some good examples that have lots and lots of members, when an issue comes up and they want the politicians to really pay attention, they stir up the membership of their interest group and they say, get in there, contact your congressman. In the old days, write them letters. Still actually is pretty effective to write letters. Nowadays, you can imagine text, send emails, contact. Now, some people say, oh, it's astroturfing. It's just interest groups creating all these things, because sometimes the messages sound the same over and over and over and over again. But if you're a politician and you're getting a lot of messages from a lot of voters saying kind of the same thing, do this or don't do that, how do you weigh that? Is that going to be an impact on the next election? If you go against them, could that impact whether or not you're going to get elected? This is one of the points of interest groups. If they're effective, the politicians may go along with them. They don't necessarily like being defeated. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, whatever, I'm just going to stand on principle. But if you got a lot of people on a particular issue that are pushing really hard on something, politicians may listen, and they may be swayed. And you can see this sometimes on some particular issues. So this is something that interest groups do as well. They work with their membership. They work with the people. They put on advertising. They put on interesting protests and messages, and connect with the voters and connect with the news media, all to get politicians, lawmakers to start moving in their direction. Okay, all right. One of the things interest groups do is they do candidate report cards. They basically try to take a whole range of issues and propose laws, and then if it's a proposed law and you're talking about somebody who's already in office, you can go, well, that's a good vote and that's a bad vote. And so, a particular interest group might go, I gave you an F on, I don't know, education because you voted the wrong way on this. And of course, it's their perspective of that particular issue. Okay, so those are things that are done sometimes with people who are in office already based on how they vote. Another time, let's say you got a bunch of candidates right here and so forth, they will send them questionnaires and ask them how they would view different particular issues, and then give them a report card based on that. So here, for example, we got a candidate report card from the American Civil Liberties Union. All right, so civil liberties, civil rights, and so forth. And here's a candidate report on the civil liberties based on these various different questions and so forth: voter suppression, racial profiling, human immigration policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let me see, who do they like? Oh, wow, they're giving all these positive things to Obama, and not so much to Romney, who's Republican presidential candidate opponent in 2012. Wow, so this helps to send the message to voters, members of the ACLU, people who care very much about that. This kind of synthesizes their perspective and says, hey, vote for this guy, he's good on these issues, and that guy's bad on those issues. Okay, so you can see candidate report cards can be very, very helpful as a means of interest groups getting their message out on candidates. Okay, now let's look at the particular types of interest groups that there are. We can see in the handout we're going to talk about business, labor, professional, civil rights groups, and so forth and so on. Right. So let's start, and we'll give some examples from the state of Idaho, though we can certainly give some examples from the nationwide as well. Sometimes they're synonymous. Do you think business is interested in how things work in politics? They really, really care. Who do you suppose was pushing very, very hard recently when with the whole coronavirus quarantine and the economy going through all kinds of difficulties? Who was pushing really, really hard for Congress and the president to come up with lots and lots and lots of money, borrow a bunch of money, lots and lots of money to help out businesses and help out employees? You get all kinds of folks. Well, businesses were in there because they're like, we're going to lose business, small businesses, big businesses, and so forth. They are pressing. They are involved in politics. They are very, very interested in outcome of elections. And they get organized. They know tax rates, spending policies, all kinds of different things are going to impact them, right? I mean, they're in business to do business. And can the government get in the way or help them or whatever? Their policies matter. One of the most important business groups, interest groups in the state of Idaho is what is called the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, sometimes referred to as IACI. I can tell you, they're like one of the if not the number one interest group in the state of Idaho. I mean, they help set policies in Idaho, working with legislators and the governor's office. They help set policies in business, but also education, all kinds of different areas. They've got their hands involved in everything because everything ultimately impacts kind of how they see things. Not always, but think about this. Which particular party do you suppose business interest groups tend to support as you look around the country? Republican? Democrat? Or do you think they like higher taxes, lower taxes? I'll tell you what, they tend to support Republican, but not entirely. They tend to want to be on the winning side. They want to have the people who are elected in office. So they work with the people in office. So in some states, business interest groups are very closely tied to Democratic politicians. Although we'll see sometimes there's a push and pull on certain things. But yeah, they've got a lot to bring to the table, a lot of money, a lot of membership, and so forth. Okay, there's some other interest groups, business interest groups. Like here's a local one, the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. They pay attention to the issues. They speak out on the issues. They've got lobbyists. I mean, think about this. Who has people in the Idaho legislature lobbying for various different laws and so forth? High school students? I mean, are high school students impacted? I mean, do they have a lobbyist? Do they have an interest group organized with a paid staffer? There are education interest groups there and so forth. We'll look at some of those ones. But I mean, here's the thing. There's a lot of different groups of people out there that don't organize. I mean, they're interested, but they don't organize. They don't have lobbyists. They're at a disadvantage, okay? Businesses know how these things work, and so they pay attention. Labor, all right? Let's talk about labor, okay? Labor unions, they've been around for a long, long time. Got started in the late 1800s. Ran into some difficulties at times. Excuse me. A labor union basically is a bunch of workers who come together to try to get well, in the case of a business, or their employer, to get better wages, better work benefits, and things like that. But when it comes to actually working in government, they're trying to get overall better policies to help the conditions and laws and things that are associated with workers. Okay, so for example, on this whole spending bill that came out having to do with the quarantine and the bad economy and the coronavirus and so forth, labor interest groups were in there as well. They were pushing for the kinds of benefits that would help unemployed workers or people who were members of the economy who were losing their jobs and having a difficult time. So one of the big interest groups in this country is the AFL-CIO. You're like, what the heck is that? American Federation of Labor, that was a big interest group, and they joined together with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. That's been around for quite some time. And so that big overall national interest group actually includes all kinds of different things. It's got some teachers in there, it's got truckers, it's got metal workers, it's got hospital workers, it's got all kinds of, like hotel workers. I mean, there's tons of various different types of groups that are involved in the AFL-CIO. They tend, write this down as well, they tend to support the Democratic Party, not entirely, but they're big boosters of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party tends to be more supportive of the kinds of policies that big labor would be interested in. And so if you get a class, say, on some particular issue between big business and big labor, you may see the Republicans a little bit more on this side and the Democrats a little bit more on this side. Although sometimes they come together and they go, hey, let's get some spending for everybody. So, sometimes it does work out. There you go, teachers unions. One of the biggest, it's not part of the AFL-CIO, one of the biggest national teachers unions is the NEA, National Education Association. And they actually are made up, it's a national organization, it's made up of lots of state organizations. So for example, in the state of Idaho, the biggest state union for teachers voluntarily joined, because you're not forced to go into a union, voluntarily joined, is the Idaho Education Association. So you got lots and lots of teachers around the country, in Idaho that voluntarily participate in that. And some of the things they do, their dues go to support a variety of different lobbying purposes to try and get better education proposals and things through the Idaho legislature. Locally, their dues are also going to help with collective bargaining. Like, what the heck? Collective bargaining, the teachers come together, they go to representatives, and they work with the board, the local school boards, and they come up with a master contract. This is what we're going to get paid. These are the holidays. These are the different things. This is sick leave. We're in agreement. Yay. Okay. So locally, so we got lots and lots of local associations. So here's a big one: Boise Education Association, BEA. Probably one of the biggest ones in the state is the West Ada Education Association. So for each of the various different ones, teachers voluntarily, I want to say the BEA, I want to say like 95, at least 95% of the teachers voluntarily contribute and are participating in that particular Teachers Association union. Okay, that's an interesting question. Was there ever any need for a local teachers union here? Oh, here's a little bit of a story for you. North Star Charter School is its own school district, right? It was created not that long ago, and we were in a small location, park near Eagle. Was there ever a need for a local teachers union? Well, actually, it turns out it was interesting. Well before our current administration, there was a brief period of time, not even a full school year, where there was a one principal who was doing some various different things. Some of you guys may have heard, if you've been, your families have been around in the North Star for a long, long time. But an interesting thing happened in that particular year. This particular administrator was like rewriting contracts that had been signed with teachers and various different things. Like, oh, we're going to change this, we're going to change that, and that full-time contract you had is going to be like, oh, so anyway, the teachers are looking around going, what the heck is this? Whoa, this isn't very good. So they were asking around and looking around and so forth, and actually it was fascinating. Early on in that school year, they looked to a couple of people in particular. They looked to somebody with legal background and started asking questions like, can they do And they actually were talking to another teacher who works just down the hall from me and who had been a president of a local teachers union, the NAMPA Education Association. Mrs. Rouse and Mrs. Rao and myself joined up with, and I think we had almost every teacher at North Star joined, and we created the North Star Education Association that year. And the goal was, one, to make sure that we were protected, and we were. And ultimately, the board watched the situation. They were like, yeah. And yeah, things got much, much better by the time we got to the end of the school year, and things have been really, really, really good since then. So fascinating. You never knew that. Maybe you did. Local teachers unions can sometimes get very, very involved when the need is there. So what about interest groups? Speaking of interest groups, when I was a lawyer, you actually didn't, I mean, you can voluntarily belong to a teachers union, but when you're a lawyer, you have to belong to the Idaho Bar Association, okay? Although there's other interest groups you can belong to having to do with professional associations, like, for example, the American Trial Lawyers Association. And these interest groups are, here we go, the American Medical Association for doctors. These are groups that these professionals belong to, give dues, get lobbyists, pay very careful attention to what the laws are, and sometimes, and try and get the laws and policies and so forth to the favorability of those particular folks. Do these two ever clash? I'll give you one example where they were on a different side. So for example, if you are a doctor and you make a mistake, right? Yeah, you can get sued. It's called medical malpractice. And you have to pay for insurance. Doctors pay for medical malpractice insurance, so that in the event that they get sued, it doesn't wipe them out. The insurance company covers. Well, how much do they have to cover? Interesting question. What is the value of a real good medical malpractice lawsuit? I mean, how much can they be sued for? I don't know. Well, it depends on what the law is, because some states will put a cap on how much a jury can award in a medical malpractice suit. Some states, the cap is like way, way, way high. Some states it's like, we're gonna keep it pretty low. We're gonna keep it low. Well, take a guess. The American Trial Lawyers Association, generally, do you think they would want to have the cap on how much the malpracticing doctors would have to pay? Their cap's going to be pretty high. AMA comes in quite a bit low. Just one example where you see a difference from professional interest groups. They tend to support Republicans and Democrats, people in office, you know. Yeah. Civil rights groups. We actually talk quite a bit about these guys in the last unit. We got the NAACP that have been around for a long, long time, get involved in court cases and activities. And I mean, good grief, in that last unit, what do we got? CORE, we got SLIC, we got SNCC, we got all kinds of various different groups that were involved in these things. The American Civil Liberties Union, although, keep an eye on this one. I mean, they speak out on like free speech and privacy rights and so forth. Not so much on Second Amendment rights, not so much on that. There's another group that's going to come in there. So the ACLU does tend to get involved in lawsuits and also lobbying in Congress and in the state legislatures and so forth for various different laws that they want. Okay, ACLU and NAACP, good examples of civil rights groups. You think the senior citizens are involved in politics? Yeah, very involved. They pay very close attention to politics. They know how these things work. One of the biggest in the country is, of course, AARP, right? You can see it in your notes, the American Association of Retired Persons. Lots of members who are well-informed. Some of them got a lot of time on their hands. They vote in high numbers. They're recipients of a lot of federal aid in the form of Social Security, Medicare, other kinds of programs that help those people who are older. They know there's a lot of competition. They don't like having cuts or caps and things and so forth, but it's, you know, there is some tension. I tell you what, they pay attention. Senior citizens groups, they pay attention. And the AARP focuses on these issues. Politicians, do they pay attention to what senior citizens are interested in? Then where they're going to vote. If there's a conflict between, say, young people and the interests of senior citizens, how's it going to play out? Well, do young people vote in big numbers? Senior citizens? That's how it plays out. Okay, so how about gun ownership? Is that a big issue? In Idaho, many states, and it varies from place to place. In some states, the political makeup on gun issues is, they'll be supportive of high gun control, right? Lots of restrictions and various different things. Idaho is an example of a state that's very much Second Amendment, right? So in Idaho, and actually in many, many states, the National Rifle Association is a very effective interest group, lots of members, and they pay lots of attention to the kinds of issues having to do with guns. And it's very interesting because they're like, well, we don't want too much restriction because then there's going to be more and there's going to be more and there's more. And man, it's just I've seen this over the last 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years where you get an incident involving a gun and then you get a whole big new debate going on about this. And ultimately, of course, what is going to be the change? What changes? Like there's background checks and so forth. That came in the federal government through the Brady bill. James Brady, he was the press secretary. He was shot in the head by a guy who was trying to kill President Reagan. So they did put that background check in place, but there's all kinds of other things that are still coming up as far as like the different kinds of levels of restrictions on gun ownership. And of course, it's the Second Amendment. You can't have a complete ban, but most of this is not left up in the courts. Most of this is in the arena of politics. And the NRA is very involved in these issues, and they pay very careful attention to these issues. They tend to have more support among Republican politicians and voters than among the Democrats. That has shifted some over the years. Sometimes you get very well-known. Charlton Heston was the president. He's not. He's not the president. Famous actor, Ben-Hur, and the 10 Commandments. And if you've ever seen it, I've got a clip right up here. You can watch it. It's the only clip I have. Planet of the Apes, right, where he's like an astronaut and he goes up and he lands on what he thinks is some other planet that's occupied by speaking apes, and the people who are stupid are the humans, and they're like slaves, and they're capturing him because he's trying to get away, and then he's like, "Get your hands off of me, dirty ape!" And they're like, "Whoa, a human can talk." Turns out he's gone back he's gone into the future. And Earth, sorry, spoilers. Earth is run by apes. I think there was some like deadly pandemic or something that wiped out humans, and the only thing that could happen was left was. Anyway, NRA, very, very involved. Lots of people, very involved in politics and very effective. Okay. Natural resource, agricultural, environmental groups. Here's some examples. There's the Idaho Conservation League, an environmental interest group in the state of Idaho. Idaho Cattle Association. Yeah, do you think these guys are going to be on the same page all the time? Not necessarily. Idaho Cattle Association may say, hey, look, we got all these grasslands and so forth. It's really good for business. Let the cattle graze on those public lands. It's good for business. The cattle need a place to go. The Idaho Conservation League might go, oh, we're not as excited about that and so forth, to the extent that maybe the cattle kick up the dirt and it silts up the streams, in which case then, it kills off some of the fish. And of course, then you get fish groups that are like, whoa, we don't like that. So you get a lot of different interest groups on these kinds of things that are very important to the state of Idaho economically and for just all kinds of different reasons. And they're playing out their various different goals through the Idaho legislature, through elections, through the news media, trying to bring positive attention and trying to get laws on their side. I mean, if you think back to like the environmental, there wasn't much of an environmental movement like 100 years ago. And then all this pollution and so forth, and so there was some serious changes in the law. And of course, you still have big advocates pushing for all kinds of various different changes in Idaho, in the country, in the world. Greta Thunberg. I mean, you've got all these different things. It's all part of politics. It's all part of the interest group politics. Okay. Let's go to the next section. Voting and elections. Of course, politics takes place all the time, but the most important days in the political season is when the elections take place, right? When people are elected into office, or as we'll see sometimes, when laws are actually enacted by the people, okay? So this is important. The rules, how this all works is very, very important in our country. All right, so let's just start off first of all. Suffrage, oh yeah, suffrage, the right to vote. Okay, let's go through these ones actually fairly quickly. Yeah, let's go through these ones. Suffrage, you got the right to vote. In the early United States of America, when we first, were created, broke off from Britain as a result of the American Revolution, there were property qualifications. You actually had to own some property in order to vote. Women couldn't vote. Children couldn't vote. If you weren't an American citizen, you couldn't vote. Now, some of those things have remained the same. Some of the things are gone now. Early on, within the first 30, 40 years of our country's history, property qualifications got sent packing. So you could have poor adult men that were able to vote, okay? Women aren't going to get the vote until, what do we got, the 19th Amendment? We covered this before, okay? 19th Amendment, again, after World War I, women proved clearly to men, yeah, they matter a great deal. Women get the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. 15th Amendment, we talked about this. The last unit, civil rights, you got the right to vote right after African Americans get the right to vote right after the Civil War. And then it gets taken away. And then they finally it comes back right there with the Voting Rights Act and getting rid of poll taxes and the 24th Amendment to get rid of literacy tests. I mean, it's like, oh my gosh. So we covered these things before. This is, I think, the third time that we've covered some of these voting rights. 26th Amendment, who gets to vote in the 26th Amendment? 18 and older, right? Many states before that said you couldn't vote until you're 21, although you go into the military and die during the Vietnam War. So the 26th Amendment is a very, very important thing, okay? Let's talk about, I should do a slide on this one. Voter registration requirements. What do you need to do in order to be a registered voter? Well, you have to register to be a voter. Okay, so let's just look at that. What do you need to do in order to register to be a voter? Okay, well, you need to live in a particular state. State residency is important. Now, what if you're like, well, I grew up in Idaho, but now I'm attending, I don't know, college in Utah or Nevada or Oregon or Montana or Washington or something like that. Can you switch your voter registration over to another state? How long do you have to be in that state in order to meet the qualifications for that state as a voter? Turns out not very long, like about a month is enough. So you could, very typical for college students who are attending school outside of their home state to re-register in another state, in the state that they're attending college. And you need like a month. Some states it's even less. You can like just show up and do it. Now, can you vote in one state and then vote in another? No, that's against the law. You can't do that. You can't vote twice in one. You can't vote twice, okay? US citizenship is a requirement pretty much everywhere in this country as far as like in order to be a voter. You need to be 18 years old, okay? Now, some states, if they wanted to, can they make it lower? They could. And there's been some discussion about, let 17-year-olds or 16-year-olds vote. I'm not aware of any state that has that yet for their voter qualification. Most states have a requirement that you not have like a felony conviction, or if you did have a felony conviction, like in the state of Idaho, you had a felony conviction, but you paid the fines, did the time, off of probation, off of parole, go back to the court. Can I get my voter registration eligibility again? You got it. Not every state is that way. So you have to go depending on which states you're at. But basically, yeah, if you are resident of the state, 18, get a vote. Okay, this sounds cool. All right, now, let's look at the next thing. Oh, there was a lot just on that one slide. How about this one? Same day voter registration. Yeah, this is pretty cool. You can register. Look, in the state of Idaho, some states, depending on their state laws, you can register. Now, you might have to have lived there for a while and prove that you've been there for like a month or so. You can't have it this huge, long time. That's just like, courts are saying, no, a state can't require you to be there like over a year. But let's say you're in Idaho, you've been there a whole month, and you want to register on the day of the election. You can do that, okay? Now, this, of course, this is the old days, like actually before the whole quarantine. You would show up, you bring proof of residency, like your driver's license has got your name, your photograph, your signature, your address, right? It's got a valid date on it, and then you can register that same day and vote, okay? Yeah, I mean, that makes it easy. A lot of the times there are states that are trying to make it easy for folks. When you go vote, let's look at this one. You vote at a polling place. Again, this is before the coronavirus. We'll get to what happens like when you can't have lots and lots of people showing up in an enclosed place. And of course, a lot of the volunteers that come in that help out with these elections are older people in the community and very, very sensitive. I think the last election that I'm aware of that had a lot of people going to was the Wisconsin presidential primary, like in March, and they had long lines and people were covering their mouths and everything and so forth. And I mean, it was like, yeah, Biden won that one, and then not too long thereafter, Sanders dropped out. But yeah, suffice it to say, we'll get to it here in a little bit. In Idaho, for the elections coming up in this month, in May, we're not doing polling places. But here's how it would work if everything's cool and everything's safe and people can go out and be in, closer than 6 feet from somebody else. The whole state is divided up into various different polling places. Think of like a neighborhood precinct, okay? Think about a neighborhood precinct as almost like sort of like your elementary school boundaries and so forth. And a lot of the polling places are elementary schools and some churches and some firehouses. And where I live, there was like a big old tire that was a polling place. So they set up the election there, and the people in those neighborhoods who are registered to vote in that particular neighborhood, they vote there. Okay, they do the ballot. Yeah, get in, get out. If you've already done your research ahead of time, you know who the candidates are, you know what the issues are. You don't have to spend a lot of time reading the thing. You read it already at home. You just go in, you grab the ballot, and go, got it, I'm done. Right? You don't have to read some big, huge, massive Idaho constitutional amendment proposal because you've already read it at home. You already know how you're going to vote. Okay. Now, this is an interesting thing because when people vote, you get a ballot, and we've been using paper ballots in Idaho for like forever. Most states have done that as well. So you get the paper ballot. What the heck is an Australian ballot? Don't they use that in Australia? What are you talking about? Australian ballot? Here's what you need to know about our ballots. They're like Australian ballots. I'm like, what? No, use Australian ballots in Australia. Use American ballots in America. Well, when I mean Australian ballots, that's the first country that came up with a standard ballot. What? It's got all the names listed on it? Yeah, it's standard. Well, what other way is there? You mean in the past they would just like hand them a piece of paper? Yeah, in past elections a long time ago, before election reforms, they would have literally, you'd have some guy walking in with a voter, and he's already got a piece of paper filled out, and that voter might not know how to read or write or anything, and his new friend is sort of helping and handing in this ballot. That ain't standardized. And oh, by the way, sometimes these new friends, they would be hanging out, handing out like whiskey and other kinds of things. And that's why a lot of states, they don't allow for the sale of hard alcohol on election day, because of the way past problems that were associated with folks that were trying to basically buy votes on election day. So we've done a lot of different reforms, and one really good reform is the Australian ballot. Here's another key thing. It's not just standard, it's secret, okay? You get the ballot when you go to the precinct, the polling place. You get the ballot, you go off to a place where nobody can see what you're doing. And you typically, like in Idaho, you'll just like, fill in the things, like you do on a test or whatever, Scantron type thing. And then you turn it in. Nobody can see what you got. Nobody's seeing how you voted and so forth. You turn it in, right? I mean, you can only vote. Don't put it in two, otherwise it won't count. I mean, the machine is going to count them. That's how it works. Secret ballot, okay? Yeah. Absentee ballots. Absentee ballot is, like, for example, you're going off to college and you decide you still want to vote in Idaho. Well, you would request an absentee ballot. It would be sent to you. You need to request it in time. It would be sent to you where you're attending college, and who knows where. You'd fill it out, and then you put it in the mail and make sure that it gets back in time. Put it in the mail by the due date so they can get back in time to your state in order to be counted. Absentee. People in the military or serving overseas, absentee ballot is the way to go, okay? Although, I tell you what, everyone's doing absentee ballots for this upcoming election in Idaho and pretty much around the country. It's basically vote by mail. That's how the absentee ballot system typically works. You get the ballot sent to you by mail, you fill it out, you put it back in the mail. Well, they're going to do all of the elections in this May in Idaho that way. It'll be interesting to see how things are in the month of November when we have our big final election as to whether or not we're going to go all by mail. You can see here, Oregon and Washington, right next door, they go all mail voting. I mean, everyone right now, they already got the system set up, okay, to do that. Well, Idaho and pretty much every other state in the country now is moving toward something like that, at least for the short-term elections. Because it's just too dangerous to have everyone showing up in a small enclosed place, you know, all lined up anyway. And your poll workers, again, some of the most vulnerable population in the community, a lot of older people that are volunteering there. Internet voting, should we trust that? Actually, Estonia, they've been messed with by Russia as far as like hacking into their internet systems and so forth. And Estonia has figured out how to have like hack-proof internet everything. And they actually do all their internet. They do pretty much everything by internet, and it's working out pretty well. So yeah, when you've been messed with as far as hacking and so forth, I don't know. Can you trust that? You know, I'm just going to type something in there. And it's like, how's that? Anyway, we can have that discussion for later. I don't think any place in the country so far has gotten into internet voting. Like I say, Estonia has, but you know, they've had a little bit more success and more experience with hacking and setting up systems to prevent hacking. Recounts. Let's look at the recount system. So what happens when an election is really, 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 really close? If I were in my classroom, I'd point to the wall where I've got my posters up for my uncles. One of my uncles, Reed Hansen, was running for re-election for the Idaho legislature. In a Republican primary, he had an opponent. So we got two Republicans, my Uncle Reed and his opponent. And his opponent beat my Uncle Reed by like 5 votes. I mean, there were like, what, 20 precincts and so forth? You know, several thousands of votes altogether, I want to say. And called for a recount. Make sure you write this down. If the margin of victory is so close, the state will give you a free, they won't charge you the cost of taking all the ballots and running them through, you know, the ballot counting computers and so forth again. If it's not quite close enough, you pay for it. And if it turns out on the recount that you're the winner now, then you get your money back. If not, you know. So anyway, 5 votes. I mean, that's pretty close. It wasn't close enough for him to have the state pay for it. So supporters of his put the money up. They put it through. It was like one precinct. In that particular time, they had like computer cards, and people were punching through on the candidates who they wanted. So they put the whole thing for one precinct through, and Uncle Reed picked up the vote. And then they did the cards for another precinct. The other guy picked up a vote. It actually turned out exactly the same, 5. So he lost in that particular primary election, which was really, really kind of sucked, because I remember I told a story about how he was a farmer, and some farmer friends of his were really, really busy on that day. And they were like, oh, wow, you should have told us there was an election. And gosh, we were out in the fields, and it would have made a difference if you'd voted. Your vote does count. One of the most famous recounts was in Florida for the presidential election. George W. Bush running for the first time for president against Al Gore, who was Bill Clinton's vice president. Very, very, very close election. And it was very, very close in Florida. Of course, Florida's a big state, it's a swing state. If Florida had gone for Gore, Gore would be president. Florida went for Bush in the first count of the election. And there was a recount. And they were doing the recount all over Florida. And they were looking at this and looking at that, and there was like, some of them, they did have these like computer punch cards and stuff, and sometimes people didn't punch it all the way through, and so you had like this little piece of paper that was sort of hanging off the back where it should have been punched all the way through and come loose, but now it was sort of like hanging, a little piece of paper. It's called a chad, so you get like these hanging chad. What does that indicate as far as the voter intent? Did they sort of go, no, I changed my mind, I didn't actually vote for that person, I changed my mind, I wanted to vote for the other person. Now if you punch both of them, no, your ballot doesn't count. But if you just sort of like, you know, some of them, they literally call them pregnant chads. Somebody you just poked it a little bit. Now, is that indication that somebody actually chose that person? So you had all these different counties, different things, some of them bubbled in and so forth. Anyway, this went through Florida, there was a recount, and there was a fight through the courts. And I mean, literally, if one vote in every precinct had changed, that would have been well enough for Al Gore to win. So don't even tell me that your vote doesn't count, because you don't know. It could count to change the election result. As it turns out, one vote did count. Because when the thing went through, you know, the Democrats are going, keep recounting, keep recounting. The Republicans are like, no, no, no. The Florida Secretary of State said it's done. And so that issue went all the way up to the Supreme Court. There were 9 justices on the Supreme Court. 5 of them said it's done. In the case of Bush versus Gore, Bush won, Gore lost. The Florida vote was final, and the electoral votes went to George W. Bush, and he was elected president in the 2000 election. Okay, that's a recount. Okay, it's a different thing when they talk about recall. A recall is where somebody's already been elected, and then the voters later on are like, wow, that person sucks. Can we get rid of them? I mean, we elected him for what, 1, 2, 5, I don't know, whatever number of years. And it's like, can we get them all out of there? You know, we don't have to wait the whole time. Make sure you write this down. For federal government offices, president, vice president, Senate, House, there's no recall. Okay, it's not in the Constitution. For most states, there's an opportunity for a recall in pretty much all kinds of different offices. The picture you see right there has to do with Wisconsin. They had a governor who was a Republican governor, Scott Walker, and there were Democrats who were like, recall him, recall him. And so what you need, write this down, you need to get a petition signed by lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of voters to even get it on the ballot to have a recall election. And when you have the recall election, then if you get enough voters to throw the person out, then that happens. It was fascinating. California, they had a weird thing some years ago. There were some folks trying to recall their governor, and it was actually kind of weird. It was set up as like they got enough signatures. Okay, so they're having the recall election for the governor. Okay, so the governor is either in or out. Well, if the governor's out, well, then who's going to take their place? Well, they had that on the ballot too. It was like a recall election, plus the second part of the ballot was, well, if this person gets thrown out, who do you vote for? And they did that. They voted the guy out, recalled him, and then they voted Arnold Schwarzenegger in, born in Austria. Yeah, the Hollywood actor, spent some time in Idaho and the Sun Valley and so forth. Yeah, he was elected as a result of a recall / election. All right, so there we go, recall. Put this down as well. Initiatives and referenda. Initiatives and referenda. The key idea here is you're not electing people. You can see right there. You're putting potential laws into effect. Okay? Initiatives and referenda. I'll give you the scoop as far as Idaho on the difference between an initiative and a referenda. They're same in that they're on the ballot, and if a majority of the voters vote in favor of them, then it's the law. Although, like with any other law, it can be gotten rid of. I'll give you examples. Here's one difference between initiative and referendum. Okay, here's a referendum in Idaho. Referendum is a proposed law, and the proposal is put there by the legislature. Okay, so the legislature, Idaho legislature itself says, we've got this idea for a law. I mean, we could pass it ourselves, but you know what? We're gonna let the voters decide. So they put it on the ballot. It's all text, and then the voters decide yes or no. Okay, initiative is much, much more complicated, because for an initiative, people, some interest group, is out there going, we want to have a law change. And so they're going to the legislature going, change the law, change the law. The legislature's going, no, not going to do it. So then an interest group has to go through the initiative process. Well, basically what that means is they have to get a lot of signatures. I mean, a lot of signatures from all around the state of Idaho. And if they get enough signatures, then it goes on the ballot. And if it gets in by a majority vote, you know, yes on, what is that, 62? Or no on this, anyway, they get it through, that doesn't even guarantee that it becomes law. Because the legislature might look and go, wow, the people have voted this way, but, you know, we're going to ignore it. Although that is dangerous for people who are elected into office, to ignore what the voters do. I don't know. Will the voters, like, I don't know, punish the lawmakers by voting them out of office if they ignore an initiative that was passed? It's always fascinating to see how that goes. One trend that has been taking place in Idaho and some other states is it has been getting harder and harder to get your initiatives on the ballot because the basic requirements have gone up. The number of signatures, for example, or the amount of time that you gather the signatures, or like how the signatures are spread out, and anyway. But this is democracy. It exists on a state level, a county level, yeah. But make sure you put this down. There is no initiative or referendum procedure for the federal government. If you want a law for the federal government, you got to go through Congress and the president, right? You want to get the Constitution amended, right? 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the state, or get the Supreme Court to agree with your way of thinking and interpret the Constitution that way. And that takes at least a 5-vote majority in the Supreme Court. Okay, there's initiatives and referendum. All right, let's talk about primary elections. All right, this is basically, if you think of primary elections versus general elections, or do I have general elections later on? No, I don't have general elections. Okay, primary elections. So we got primary, think of that early, that's first stage, general, final stage. Primary, first stage, general is the final stage. Primary in Idaho is in May. The presidential primary is in March, but the primaries as far as like all the other offices on election for this year, May. General, the final election is in November. Okay, here's another thing you need to know about primaries. It's among candidates from the same party. All right, so you get Republicans running against Republicans, Democrats running against Democrats, or maybe there's just one person for each running for a particular position. So if you, in Idaho, we have what's called the closed primary system. Okay, so we get a difference between open and closed. Used to we had open, and like, what the heck is the difference between open and closed? I'll tell you. Open, you show up at the polling place, the precinct, you ask for your ballot on a primary election, and nobody knows nothing. That day, you could be a Republican or Democrat, just as long as you stay on that side of the ballot, voting among who the Republican candidate should be, who should get the vote, or the Democrat ones. Now, general election, you can pick and choose. You can vote some Republicans, some Democrats, and so forth. But when it was an open primary, nobody knew. Well, now it's closed. In Idaho, it's closed. We changed the law, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. So you have to declare. You have to register as a Republican or as a Democrat. And it is a public document. So you can look up and see whether somebody's a registered Republican or Democrat. Of course, if you're a judge or like a journalist and you're trying to be all unbiased and everything, I mean, could you be registered as like a nonpartisan? Yes, but then you don't get to participate in the primary election. Okay. In Idaho, what do you think? More registered Republicans or more registered Democrats? More registered Republicans. Mostly Republican state. Okay. So those ballots, and actually this year, did I mention already? Coronavirus, quarantine. Yeah. You can go online and request your ballot. They'll send it to you. I already got mine. I already filled it out. Put it back in the mail. I'm done. I voted. I mean, I think the election due date is like the Tuesday after Memorial Day or something like that. I've already elected. Most people would have already voted. And I think a lot of states are now going to that method. Okay, so whoever wins in the primary is that party's candidate for the general election. So I want to say, like, I think in some of the legislative districts, there's several different Republicans running against each other, and whoever wins in each of those different races will be the Republican on the ballot going up against the Democrat on the ballot. And sometimes you got some races where there's a couple of Democrats and so forth. Okay, is that pretty clear? All right, primary versus general. Okay, oh yeah, there we go. Elephant. What the heck? Oh, in case you didn't know, the elephant is the Republican. I'll explain that more, how the elephant got to be the Republican Party mascot. Donkey is the Democrat Party mascot. So if you ever see that, if you ever see some crazy thing like this, and I've never seen it except for here, a Demopublican, whatever, it looks like a donkey with an elephant thing and so forth, doesn't exist. Those are the symbols: Republican, Democrat, elephant, donkey. Okay, moving on. Coattails, let's talk about coattails. This is very, very interesting. This is a very archaic term when politicians wore long coats. I mean, like a formal coat. It really would have long tails. And so the idea is if you're a very, very popular politician, say at the top of the ticket, at the top of the ballot, say running for president, or maybe in a non-presidential election, you're running for governor, or perhaps, Senate or so forth. If you're really, really popular in your party, you're going to bring out a lot of voters in favor of your candidacy. And then as they get the ballot, they're like, for example, here, this is in the state of Washington, which tends to be a blue state. Democrats very strong in the state of Washington. Obama got a lot of votes when he ran for president in 2008. And he picked up a lot of votes in the state of Washington. He carried, the idea is he's carried, literally, you can see this right here. This is Democrat candidate, I believe she was running for governor of the state of Washington, Gregoire. And so she's like hanging on to it. And so he's almost like, this candidate has got long coattails. President Obama helping other Democrats in places where he's very popular. Now, is there a contrast? Yes. So for example, in states where the Democratic candidate for president or the top of the ticket is not as popular, right? Here you go, GOP, Grand Old Party, Republican, not as popular. The coattails don't work so much there. The influence doesn't work so much, right? Obama's not winning in that state, and you bring out lots of like anti-Obama voters. What do you think? Who tends to do much better in the state of Idaho during presidential election years? Who tends to turn out in greater numbers in presidential election years? Republican voters? So yeah, Obama wouldn't have coattails so much in Idaho. In fact, he didn't. The Republican candidates tended to do even better in presidential election years. Would Trump have long coattails in the state of Idaho? Or do the voters kind of like look at it different and go, well, we see this way for the president's race and we see this way for all the other races? Anyway, it's an interesting notion. Another item is called ballot fatigue. This is fascinating. I'm talking to my brother about this because he's on the ballot. Ada County Highway District Commission, he's going to be on the ballot in November. And his race is one of the last races. So the idea about ballot fatigue is like, oh, I'm so tired. I've got this ballot and I can't read through everything. Buck up. This is democracy. Seriously? Yeah, it's not just the presidential race that matters. It's also the federal races, for Congress. Oh, and how about the state races and local races? And see these things right here? I can't read this, way too small. But this would be examples of like, constitutional proposals for the state of Idaho, or maybe like, taxing proposals or some local changes in some of the laws and things like that. Pay attention. You're in charge. You're the voter. Do your homework. Don't give me this ballot fatigue, but this is what happens. So, for example, among the people who get the ballot, right, there's about almost like a 50% drop off. By the time you get to some of the latter pieces here, people are like, oh, I don't know. It's not just sort of like they're tired. They're uninformed. Didn't do the homework. I mean, and if you just rely on the news to do your homework for you, forget it. You have to actually do a little bit of work yourself to find out what's going on here. Do some research, look up some stuff, because the local news media are not going to be covering all of these races very carefully. You hope they would, but sometimes they're not. So, but that does happen, right? You get some tail off as you go through the ballot. Biggest turnout, presidential election years. Smaller turnout, non-presidential election years. And the first ones on the ballot are going to be a presidential race and your other state and local races, and then it gets into some of these things and it tails off a little bit. Okay. Voter turnout. Let's talk about some voter turnout trends and so forth here. Let's go right to the first one here. So we got differences according to sex, male, female, and we got differences according to age. Wow, here we go. Wow, women vote in higher percentage than guys. Go girl. Go ladies. Because as you see here, the voting percentage increases the older the voter is. I don't know what the scoop is with 75 and older according to this chart here. But I mean, new voters, they're just not as tuned in. I told you, the politicians know that. They're paying attention more so to what the older voters are thinking about, because the older voters are voting. I mean, they're eligible and they pay attention and they vote. It's one of the reasons I went into teaching. Come on, young voters, get involved, get started right away, because the issues impact you right away. You got freedom of speech before you're 18. For goodness sakes, use it. And definitely use your right to vote. Definitely. Make a difference. Don't be an idiot. What are you talking? That's rude. What are you talking about? It's a Greek word, idiot. It was used a long, long time ago in the early stages of Greek democracy. Basically, it meant this. Let's say you were living in Athens, right? So you're a guy, you're a citizen, you're an adult. All right, you got to participate. You got to go to the Athenian assembly. You got to listen to the debates. You got to participate. You got to vote. They literally would refer to people who were eligible to vote and participate. All they needed to do was pay attention and do it. And if they didn't, they're an idiot. Politically, it's a tough word. I should have voted. To me, it's too hard. It's a pain. Democracy is a difficult thing. But remember at the beginning of the year, we did that whole unit on totalitarian dictatorship? Really? You want that instead? It's so much simpler. If they even have elections, like, here's the ballot. Do this one. We're watching. No, in this country, you need to pay attention to the issues. And if you don't like who the candidates are, run yourself. Recruit other people. Get involved. Right? There's a term in political science called political efficacy. Efficacy is that idea that I don't have efficacy. I can't make any difference. Nothing matters. My vote doesn't count. Oh my gosh, my vote doesn't count. Right? Like those guys that called my uncle and was like, oh, we didn't know there was an election. Yes, your vote counts. And it could count actually very specifically in a very close race. You don't know how close the race is going to be. Now, some people, they just don't. They're like, my vote doesn't change anything. Yes, it's all frustrating and so forth. It's not. Do you want the alternative? You want to just get rid of democracy and so forth? Democracy is crazy, but it's a much better system than any others that are out there. But it really, really does require people who are informed, who are active, who spread their points of view in an intelligent manner, in a fair manner, and participate in the elections. What does this say? You can either vote by voting or vote by not voting. Wow, if you don't vote, somebody else's vote counts more. It's math. Wow, we got some math here into political science. And actually, it's true. So what you're typically going to find as far as politics is, different groups that are advocating, like, if people want, Trump or Biden and so forth, they're going to try and get their voters to turn out because it matters. And there will also be other folks that will be trying to depress the vote of the other side. We're going, your candidate sucks, and they did these bad things and this bad thing and so forth, and depress that voter turnout and so forth. And we'll get into, what about third-party candidates and all that? We'll get into that next time. It gets very, very, very interesting as we go forward on this. Okay, so yeah, I think that's what we got here for the lesson. Yeah, like I say, next time we're gonna look at political parties. We're gonna give you some analysis of the presidential race as well, because that's gonna factor very much. You've been watching this, right? If you missed any of the civil rights movement videos, you need those, because that's gonna come up on the assessment for you, for your essay as well. There'll be an essay on those politics. So we've done 2. There's 1 more. Pay attention. It's all good. Okay, if you have any questions, contact me. Otherwise, be safe, be healthy, and we'll see you.